In the height of election season, India swelters under a heat wave. The history of Asian empires warns us, climate disasters wait for no one. The most populous city in the world was laid low by the monsoon. The most advanced Bronze Age civilization was emptied by drying weather, and climate disasters played into the fall of both North Indian and South Indian empires. The largest Hindu temple in the world, Angkor Wat, is reflected in the waters of a man-made lake. Around it is the vast abandoned city, Angkor, Cambodia. In the 12th to 13th century CE, Angkor was perhaps the largest city in the world, larger even than Indian cities at the time. Extending nearly 1,000 square kilometers, the region was home to as many as 1 million people. In comparison, the largest pre-modern Indian city, Vijayanagara, had perhaps 400,000 inhabitants. To feed so many mouths, the people of Angkor built hydraulic works over the course of 300 years, gradually expanding and connecting smaller systems. The end result was a stupendous water collection and distribution network extending over nearly 3,000 square kilometers. An extensive multidisciplinary study, which you can read here, found that this consisted of 3 main zones. Rivers flowing from the Colin mountains to the north were diverted in the first uppermost zone. The middle zone aggregated all this water in massive tanks in the city. They had a total capacity of up to 1.2 billion liters. Many of these tanks surrounded temples or were adjacent to them. This enormous body of water was slowly released over the course of the year for rice cultivation, tiding the city through Cambodia's long summers. Extra water was collected by a drainage zone and delivered to the Tonle Sap Lake, the largest freshwater body in Southeast Asia. But Angkor was hit by a series of climate disasters in the 14th century, seriously weakening its water systems. Part of the flaw lay in the system itself. It wasn't a single united plan, but a series of expansions and corrections to smaller plans, all with their own issues. Hydrologist Matti Kummu writes in this paper that in the upper hydraulic zone, Angkor's engineers built straight collection channels, breaking apart the catchment area of the Puok River and cutting the water across the natural slope. The thing is that water flows much faster in straight channels, eroding the banks and depositing massive quantities of silt. But the much bigger problem was 2 droughts that lasted for decades in the 14th century. Angkor's engineers were forced to make expensive modifications to their system, but then right after the drought, torrential mega monsoons overloaded the fragile water system, destroying huge sections and forcing the city's kings and masses to move elsewhere. The climate wasn't the only factor in the collapse of Asian empires. In his new book Pax Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World, historian Colin Elliott studied the Antonine Plague, a mysterious disease that swept through much of Europe in the 2nd century CE. He found that the pandemic benefited from Rome's unhygienic urban centers, its poor health infrastructure, and its excellent road connectivity. This worsened existing problems in the empire's fragile economic and health supply systems, and it almost certainly came from the east via Iran and possibly from India. Elliott points out that at the same time, Hariti, a Buddhist goddess associated with disease and childbirth, appears quite frequently in the art of the Kushan Empire in northern India. We talked about the Kushan Empire in this video here. It's possible that all this was linked, but we don't have all the evidence we need to be sure. The thing is, unlike Angkor and Rome, India hasn't been able to fund multidisciplinary studies on pre-modern disease and the environment. And so when Indian writers talk about our relationship with the environment, we tend to congratulate ourselves that our ancestors lived in perfect harmony with nature. We usually arrive at that conclusion by massively overinterpreting texts with no other data. Just look at the Google results for ancient India environment and you'll see what I mean. But Indians could and did engineer their environments and created fragile systems that collapsed under environmental pressure. The best attested example of this is the Indus Valley civilization, which, as my colleague Disha Ahluwalia writes in this article, was de-urbanized by increasingly arid climates. Environmental stress also played into the collapse of the Chola Empire in South India. As historian R. Tirumalai writes in Land Grants and Agrarian Reactions in Chola and Pandya Times, from the 12th century onwards, there were repeated floods in the Kaveri and Cheyar river systems. The floods were bad enough, but landlords disastrously mismanaged the crisis, insisting that cultivators pay tax to them anyway. Others used the crisis as an opportunity to buy land for cheap. This short-sighted speculation made many people rich but left others destitute. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, inscriptions reveal that people were selling themselves into slavery. Natural crisis was worsened by human mismanagement. There are other tantalizing examples. In The Fate of Rome, A Climate, a Disease and the End of an Empire, historian Kyle Harper studied ice cores and tree rings. It turns out that in 536 CE, volcanic eruptions led to a catastrophic global cooling. Documents from all over the world describe a darkening of the skies, longer winters and failing harvests. And around the same time, in India, the Huns from Central Asia were pressing into the Gangetic Plains, leading to the collapse of the Gupta Empire. These events were almost certainly interconnected, but through what mechanisms? At least we know what cooling climates led to in the Mediterranean Sea. Failing harvests stressed revenue systems, reduced immunity caused pandemics, migrations and wars wiped out trade. The point of all this isn't to terrify, but to point out that we have to learn from the past. Yes, climate change is coming, but each example that we saw teaches us a different lesson. Angkor shows us that we need to build and maintain resilient systems and accurate climate models that are prepared for catastrophe. The Romans and Kushans remind us to take public health seriously and not to leave everything to the gods. The Harappans suggest that smaller cities might be better adapted to changing climates, and the Chola aristocracy is a warning that inequalities will worsen. Finally, the collapse of the Gupta Empire hints at what's coming in future decades: failing harvests, migrations, pandemics, and decreasing trade. We can't keep going the way we are and pretend everything will be fine. The least we can do is learn from the triumphs and struggles of our ancestors. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.